Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. This is part 2 of John Woolman's Plea for the Poor. I will have commentary to follow. We are starting in chapter 10. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall to the ground without your Father? The way of carrying on wars common in the world is so far distinguishable from the purity of Christ's religion that many scruple to join in them. Those who are so redeemed from the love of the world as to possess nothing in a selfish spirit, their life is hid with Christ in God, and these he preserves in resignedness, even in times of commotion. As they possess nothing but what pertains to his family, anxious thoughts about wealth or dominion hath little or nothing in them to work upon, and they learn contentment in being disposed of according to his will, who, being omnipotent and always mindful of his children, causeth all things to work for their good. But where that spirit which loves riches works, and in its working gathers wealth and cleaves to customs which have their root in self-pleasing, this spirit, thus separating from universal love, seeks help from that power which stands in the separation, and whatever name it hath, it still desires to defend the treasures thus gotten. This is like a chain, where the end of one link encloses the end of another. The rising up of a desire to attain wealth is the beginning. This desire being cherished moves to action, and riches thus gotten please self, and while self hath a life in them, it desires to have them defended. Wealth is attended with power, by which bargains and proceedings contrary to universal righteousness are supported, and here oppression, carried on with worldly policy and order, clothes itself with the name of justice, and becomes like a seed of discord in the soil. And as this spirit which wanders from the pure habitation prevails, so the seed of war swells and sprouts and grows and becomes strong, till much fruit are ripened. Thus cometh the harvest spoken of by the prophet, which is a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. Oh, that we who declare against wars and acknowledge our trust to be in God only may walk in the light, and therein examine our foundation and motives in holding great estates. May we look upon our treasures and the furniture of our houses and the garments in which we array ourselves, and try whether the seeds of war have any nourishment in these our possessions or not. Holding treasures in the self-pleasing spirit is a strong plant, the fruit whereof ripens fast. A day of outward distress is coming, and divine love calls to prepare against it. Hearken then, O ye children, who have known the light, and come forth. Leave everything which our Lord Jesus Christ does not own. Think not his pattern too plain or too coarse for you. Think not a small portion in this life too little. But let us live in his spirit, and walk as he walked, and he will preserve us in the greatest troubles. Chapter 11. The heavens, even the heavens, are the Lord's, but the earth hath he given to the children of men. Psalm 115:16. As servants of God, what land or estate we hold under him as his gift. And in applying these prophets, it is our duty to act consistent with the design of our benefactor. Imperfect men may give on motives of misguided affection, but perfect wisdom and goodness gives agreeable to his own nature. Nor is this gift absolute, but conditional, for us to occupy as dutiful children and not otherwise, for he alone is the proprietor. The world, saith he, is mine, and the fullness thereof. Psalm 24:1. The inspired lawgiver directed that such of the Israelites who sold their inheritance should sell it for a term only, and that they or their children should again enjoy it in the year of Jubilee, settled on every 50th year. The land shall not be sold forever, for this land is mine, saith the Lord. For ye are strangers and sojourners with me. Leviticus 25:23. The design of which was to prevent the rich from oppressing the poor by too much engrossing the land. And our blessed Redeemer said, Till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law until all be fulfilled. Where divine love takes place in the hearts of any people, and they steadily act on a principle of universal righteousness, there the true intent of the law is fulfilled, though their outward modes of proceeding may be distinguishable from one another. But where men are possessed by the spirit hinted at by the prophet, and looking over their wealth, say in their hearts, "Have we not taken to us horns by our own strength?" Here they deviate from the divine law, and do not account their possessions so strictly God's, nor the weak and the poor entitled to so much of the increase thereof, but that they may indulge their desires in conforming to worldly pomp. And thus, where house is joined to house and field laid to field, till there is no place, and the poor are thereby straitened, though this be done by bargains and purchase, yet so far as it stands distinguished from universal love, so far that woe prefixed by the prophet will accompany their proceedings. As he who first formed the earth out of nothing was then the true proprietor of it, so he still remains. And though he hath given it to the children of men, so that multitudes of people have had sustenance from it, while they continue here, yet he hath never aliened it. But his right to give is as good as at the first, nor can any apply the increase of their possessions contrary to universal love, nor dispose of land in a way which they know tends to exalt some by oppressing others, without being justly chargeable with usurpation. Chapter 12. If we count back 150 years and compare the inhabitants of Great Britain with the natives of North America on like compass of ground, the natives, I suppose, would bear a small proportion to the others. On the discovery of this fertile continent, many of those thick-settled inhabitants coming over, the natives generally treated them kindly at the first, and as those brought iron tools and a variety of things convenient for man's use, these gladly embraced the opportunity of traffic and encouraged those foreigners to settle. I speak only of improvements made peaceably. Thus our gracious Father, who at the same time beholds the situation of all his creatures, hath opened a way from a thick-settled land and given us some room on this. Now if we attentively consider the turning of God's hand in thus far giving us room on this continent, and that the offspring of those ancient possessors of this country, in whose eyes we appear as newcomers, are yet owners and inhabitants of the land adjoining to us, and that their way of life, requiring much room, hath been transmitted to them from their predecessors, and probably settled by the custom of a great many ages. Under these considerations, we may see the necessity of cultivating the lands already obtained of them, and applying the increase consistent with true wisdom, so as to accommodate the greatest number of people it is capable of, before we have any right to plead, as members of the one great family, the equity of their assigning to us more of their possessions, and living in a way requiring less room. Did we all walk as became the followers of our blessed Savior? Were all those fruits of our country retained in it which are sent abroad in return for such strong drink, such costly array, and other luxuries which we should then have no use for, and the labor and expense of importing and exporting applied to husbandry and useful trades, a much greater number of people than now reside here might, with a divine blessing, live comfortably on the lands already granted us by these ancient possessors of the country. If we faithfully serve God, who hath given us some room on this land, I believe he will make some of us useful among them, both in publishing the doctrines of his Son, our Savior, and in pointing out to them the advantages of replenishing the earth and subduing it. Some, I expect, will be careful for such poor people abroad who earn their bread in preparing and trading in those things which we, as true disciples, living in a plainness like our heavenly pattern, should have no use for. But laying aside all superfluities and luxuries, while people are so much thicker settled in some parts than in others, a trade in some serviceable articles may be to mutual advantage, and carried on with much more regularity and satisfaction to a sincere Christian than the trade now generally is. One person in society continuing to live contrary to true wisdom commonly draws others into connection with him, and where these embrace the way this first hath chosen, their proceedings are like a wild vine which, springing from a single seed and growing strong, the branches extend and their little twining holders twist round all herbs and boughs of trees where they reach, and are so braced and locked in that without much labor or great strength they are not disentangled. Thus these customs, small in their beginning, as they increase they promote business and traffic, and many depend on them for a living. But as it is evident that all business which hath not its foundation in true wisdom is unbecoming a faithful follower of Christ, who loves God not only with all his heart, but with all his strength and ability to labor and act in the world. And as the Lord is able to, and will, support those whose hearts are perfect toward him, in a way agreeable to his unerring wisdom, it becomes us to meditate on the privileges of his children, to remember that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty, and that in joining to customs which we know are wrong, there's a departing from the purity of his government, and a certain degree of alienation from him. To lay aside curious costly attire, and use that only which is plain and serviceable, to cease from all superfluities and too much strong drink, are agreeable to the doctrines of our blessed Redeemer, and if in the integrity of our hearts we do so, we in some degree contribute toward the lessening that business which hath its foundation in a wrong spirit. And as some well-inclined people are entangled in such business and at times desirous of being freed from it, such our ceasing from these things may be made helpful to them. And though for a time their businesses fail, yet if they humbly ask wisdom of God and are truly resigned to him, he will not fail them nor forsake them. He who created the earth and hath provided sustenance for millions of people in past ages is now as attentive to the necessities of his children as ever. To press forward toward perfection is our duty, and if herein we lessen some business by which some poor people earn their bread, the Lord who calls to cease from these things will take care of those whose businesses fail by it, if they sincerely seek to him. If the connections we have with the inhabitants of those provinces and our interests considered as distinct from others engage us to promote plain living in order to enrich our own country, though a plain life is in itself best, yet by living plain in a selfish spirit, we advance not forward in true religion. Divine love, which enlarges the heart toward mankind universally, is that alone which can rightly stop every corrupt stream and open those channels of business and commerce where nothing runs that is not pure, and so establish our goings, that when in our labor we meditate on the universal love of God and the harmony of holy angels, this serenity of our minds may never be clouded in remembering that some part of our employment tends to support customs which have their foundation in the self-seeking spirit. Chapter 13. While our minds are prepossessed in favor of customs distinguishable from perfect purity, we are in danger of not attending with singleness to that light which opens to our view the nature of universal righteousness. In the affairs of a thick-settled country are variety of useful employments besides tilling the earth, that for some men to have no more land than is necessary to build on and to answer the occasions relative to the family may consist with brotherhood, and from the various gifts which God hath bestowed on those employed in husbandry, for some to possess and occupy much more than others may likewise. But where any, on the strength of their possessions, demands such rent or interest as necessitates those who hire of them to a closer application to business than our merciful Father designed for us, this puts the wheels of perfect brotherhood out of order, and leads to employments, the promoting of which belongs not to the family of Christ, whose example in all parts of being a pattern of wisdom, so the plainness and simplicity of this outward appearance may well make us ashamed to adorn our bodies in costly array, or treasure up wealth by the least degree of oppression. The soil yields us support and is profitable for man, and though some possessing a larger share of these profits than others may consist with the harmony of true brotherhood, yet that the poorest people who are honest, so long as they remain inhabitants of the earth, are entitled to a certain portion of those profits, in as clear and absolute a sense as those who inherit much, I believe will be agreed by those whose hearts are enlarged with universal love. The first people who inhabited the earth were the first who had possession of the soil. The gracious Creator and owner of it gave the fruits thereof for their use, and as one generation passed away, another came and took possession, and thus through many ages innumerable multitudes of people have been supplied by the fruits of the earth. But our gracious Creator is as absolute the owner of it as he was when he first formed it out of nothing, before man had possession of it. And though by claims, grounded on prior possession, great inequality appears amongst men, yet the instructions of the great proprietor of the earth is necessary to be attended to in all our proceedings, as possessors or claimers of the profits of the soil. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, Psalm 37:23, and those who are thus guided, whose hearts are enlarged in his love, give directions concerning their possessions agreeable thereto. and that claim which stands on universal righteousness is a good right, but the continuance of that right depends on properly applying the profits thereof. The word right is commonly used relative to our possessions. We say a right of property to such a dividend of a province or a clear, indisputable right to the land within such certain bounds. Thus this word is continued as a remembrancer of the original intent of dividing the land by boundaries, and implies that it was designed to be equitably and rightly divided, to be divided according to righteousness. In this, that is, in equity and righteousness, consists the strength of our claims. If we trace an unrighteous claim and find gifts or grants to be proved by sufficient seals and witnesses, this gives not the claimant a right, for that which is opposite to righteousness is wrong, and the nature of it must be changed before it can be right. Suppose 20 free men, professed followers of Christ, discovered an island unknown to all other people, and that they with their wives, independent of all others, took possession of it, and dividing it equitably, made improvements and multiplied. Suppose these first possessors, being generally influenced by true love, did with paternal regard look over the increasing condition of the inhabitants, and near the end of their lives gave such directions concerning their respective possessions as best suited to the convenience of the whole, and tended to preserve love and harmony, and that their successors, in the continued increase of people, generally followed their pious example, and pursued means the most effectual to keep oppression out of their island. But suppose that one of these first settlers, from a fond attachment to one of his numerous sons, no more deserving than the rest, gives the chief of his lands to him, and by an instrument sufficiently witnessed, strongly expresses his mind and will. Suppose this son, being landlord to his brethren and nephews, demands such a portion of the fruits of the earth as may supply him and his family and some others, and that these others, thus supplied out of his store, are employed in adorning his buildings with curious engravings and paintings, preparing carriages to ride in, vessels for his house, delicious meats, fine wrought apparel, and furniture, all suiting that distinction lately arising between him and the other inhabitants. And that having this absolute disposal of these numerous improvements, his power so increaseth that in all conferences relative to the public affairs of the island, those plain, honest men, who are zealous for equitable establishments, find great difficulty in proceeding agreeable to their righteous inclinations, while he stands in opposition to them. Suppose he, from a fondness for one of his sons, joined with a desire to continue this grandeur under his own name, confirms chief of his possessions to him, and thus for many ages, on near a 20th part of the island, there's one great landlord, and the rest generally poor, oppressed people, to some of whom from this manner of their education, joined with a notion of the greatness of their predecessors, labor is disagreeable, who therefore, by artful applications of the weakness, unguardedness, and corruption of others, in striving to get a living out of them, increases the difficulties among them, while the inhabitants of the other parts who guard against oppression, and with one constant train up their children in plainness, frugality, and useful labor, live more harmonious. If we trace the claim of the 9th or 10th of these great landlords down to the first possessor, and find the claim supported throughout by instruments strongly drawn and witnessed, after all we could not admit a belief into our hearts that he had a right to so great a portion of the land, after such a numerous increase of inhabitants. The first possessor of the 20th part held no more, we suppose, than an equitable portion. But when the Lord, who first gave these 20 men possession of the island unknown to all others, gave being to numerous people who inhabited this 20th part, whose natures required the fruits thereof for their sustenance, this great claimer of the soil could not have a right to the whole, to dispose of it in gratifying his irregular desires. But they, as creatures of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, had a right to part of what this great claimer held, though they had no instruments to confirm their right. Thus, oppression in the extreme appears terrible, but oppression in more refined appearances remains to be oppression, and where the smallest degree of it is cherished it grows stronger and more extensive, that to labor for a perfect redemption from the spirit of oppression is the great business of the whole family of Christ Jesus in this world. Chapter 14. On Schools. When we are thoroughly instructed in the kingdom of God, we are content with that use of things which his wisdom points out, both for ourselves and our children, and are not concerned to learn them the art of getting rich, but are careful that the love of God and a right regard for all their fellow creatures may possess their minds, and that in all their learning their improvements may go forward in pure wisdom. Christ, our shepherd, being abundantly able and willing to instruct his family in all things proper for them to know, it remains to be our duty to wait patiently for his help in teaching our families, and not seek to forward them in learning by the assistance of that Spirit from which he gave his life to redeem us. It was his own saying that the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light, and it appears by experience that in awakening and cherishing the spirit of pride and the love of praise in children, they may sometimes be brought on in learning faster than they would otherwise. But while in learning any art or science, they accustom themselves to disobey the pure spirit, and grow strong in that wisdom which is foolishness with God, they must have the painful labor of unlearning a part of what they thus learned, before they are adopted into the divine family. It is therefore good for us in schools and in all parts of education to attend diligently to the principle of universal light, and patiently wait for their improvement in the channel of true wisdom, without endeavoring to get help from the spirit which seeks honor from men. It is through a deviation from the pure light that people desire to help from the spirit of this world in pushing forward their children in learning, that they may save out of their education to support ways of life less plain and simple than what our holy patterns has laid out for us. Children in an age fit for schools are in a time of life that requires the careful and patient attendance of their tutors, and such a diligent observation of their several tempers and dispositions, as that they may be enabled rightly and seasonably to administer to each individual. Were we thoroughly weaned from the love of wealth and fully brought out of all superfluities in living, employments about vanities being finished and labor wanted only for things consistent with a humble, self-denying life, there would, on a reasonable estimate, be so much to spare on the education of our children that a plain, humble man with a family like himself might be furnished with a living for teaching and overseeing so small a number of children that he might properly and seasonably administer to each individual, and gently lead them on as the gospel spirit opened the way, without giving countenance to pride or evil emulation amongst them. The management of children being sometimes committed to men who do not live under the seasoning virtue of truth is a case that requires our serious consideration, for that it is our indispensable duty to use our utmost endeavors in their education to bring them into an acquaintance with the inward work of grace. And where a tutor is not experienced in this work, their spirit and conduct in directing and ordering the children does often make impressions on their tender, inexperienced minds to their great disadvantage. Again, where pious men enter into this employ, they sometimes find it difficult to support their families without taking charge of so great a number that they cannot so fully attend to the spirit and disposition of each individual as would be profitable to the children. A large number of children in a school is often a heavy weight on the mind of an honest tutor, and when his thoughts and time are so much taken up in the more outward affairs of the school that he cannot so attend to the spirit and temper of each individual as to administer rightly and seasonably in the line of true judgment, there the minds of children often suffer, and a wrong spirit gains strength, which frequently increases difficulties in a school, and like an infection spreads from one to another. A man influenced by the spirit of truth, employing his time in tutoring children, while he hath only such a number that the manifestation of divine strength in him is superior to the instability in them, this good spirit in which he governs does measurably work on their minds, and tends to bring them forward in the Christian life. But where the straitness of a man's circumstances, joined with the small wages set on teaching children, proves a temptation, and so enters into his heart that he takes charge of too many for the measure of his gift, or where the desire for wealth so corrupts the heart of any that they take charge of too many, here the true order of a Christian education is lost. But where a man hath charge of a number too great for the degree of strength with which the Lord hath endowed him, he not only suffers as to the state of his own mind, but the children suffer also. And government, not being supported in the true Christian spirit, the pure witness is not reached in the minds of his children. To educate children in the way of true piety and virtue is a duty incumbent on all of us who have them, and our Heavenly Father requires no duties of us but what he gives strength to perform, as we humbly seek to him. That though to the eye of reason the difficulties appear great in many places, which attend instructing our children in useful learning, yet if we obediently attend to that wisdom which is from above, our gracious Father will open a way for us to give them such an education as he requires of us. And here I may say that my mind hath been sorrowfully affected on account of some, who from a desire for wealth, a desire to conform in living to those ways distinguishable from the true Christian spirit, exert themselves in things relating to this life, and do not enough lay to heart the suffering condition of youth in many places, through want of pious examples and tutors whose minds are seasoned with the spirit of truth. Are great labors performed to gain wealth for posterity? Are many supported with wages to furnish us with delicacies and luxuries? Are monies expended for colors to please the eye, which renders our garments less serviceable? Are garments of a curious texture purchased at a high rate for the sake of their delicacy? Are there various branches of workmanship only ornamental, in the building of our houses, hanging by our walls and partitions, and to be seen in our furniture and apparel? And amidst all these expenses, which the pure truth does not require of us, do we send our children to men to get learning who we believe are not influenced by the spirit of truth, rather than humbly wait on the Lord for wisdom to direct us in their education? To commit children to the tuition of men who we believe are not rightly qualified to lead them on in the true Christian life, I believe no pious man will say is required of us as a duty. To do evil, that good may come of it, is contrary to the doctrine of Christianity, that when times are so cloudy that we cannot go forward in the way of clearness and purity, it behooves us, in the depth of humility, to wait on the Lord to know his mind concerning us and our children. Chapter 15. On Masters and Servants. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Ephesians 6:5. It is observable in several places where the apostle writes to servants that he labors, to direct their minds to the true light, that in laboring in the condition of servants, they might, as the apostle expresseth, do the will of God from the heart, that their labors might not be like those of men-pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God, and that in whatsoever they did, they might do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men. As the pure principle of righteousness is the foundation whereon the pure in heart stand, so their proceedings are consistent herewith. And while they encourage to an upright performance of every reasonable duty on one hand, they guard on the other against servants actively complying with unrighteous commands, doing service as to the Lord and not unto men, by which we are instructed in the necessity of a humble walking before God, that by faithfully attending on the leading of his Spirit, our senses may be exercised to discern both good and evil. And that as the righteous commands of masters ought to be obeyed, because they were righteous, so on the contrary, such commands of men which could not be performed without disobeying God were not sufficient authority for a servant of Christ to proceed upon, but herein we ought to obey God rather than men. The present concern of my mind is that all who are in the station of masters may seriously consider this subject, and demand nothing of servants which is unreasonable, or that in the performance of which they must necessarily act contrary to universal righteousness. A pious father hath a conscientious care for his children, that by his labors they may be rightly educated, and have some things which necessarily relate to their first settling in the world. But where a man seeth his righteous intentions perverted, and his labors made to serve purposes which are not equitable, and hath no hopes of a remedy, his case is very grievous. For here, however disposed to labor, he cannot labor heartily as to the Lord and not unto men. To comply with demands which are not equitable is afflicting to a well-disposed mind, and for a man in power to demand service of another, without proposing an equitable reward, appears to me to have the spirit of persecution in it. Upright men laboring in temporal affairs have in view to do good thereby. They labor because they are convinced it is their duty. But where labors, not equitably due, are required of them to gratify the covetous, luxurious, or ambitious designs of others, this lays conscientious men under great difficulty. If they comply not, they are liable to punishment, and if they do that which they believe is not right for them to do, they wound their own souls. Chapter 16. To keep Negroes as servants till they are 30 years of age, and hold the profits of the last 9 years of their labor as our own, on a supposition that they may sometime be an expense to our estates, is a way of proceeding which appears to admit of improvement. Reasons offered. Men of mature age who have walked orderly and made no contract to serve, that they are entitled to freedom, I expect is generally agreed to, and to make them serve as slaves 9 years longer may be to keep them slaves for term of life. They may die before that age and be no expense to us, and may leave children to whom, with reason, they might in their last sickness desire to give the moneys they had earned after they had paid for their own education. 2. The labor of a healthy, industrious Negro man for 9 years, I suppose, at a moderate computation, may not be less than 50 pounds, proclamation money, besides his diet and clothing. Now if this money be earned either in the service of a man who educated him, or laid by in yearly proportion under the care of the said man, and then put out a moderate interest for a Negro's use, and to be applied to his future necessities, or to such honest purposes as he by his last will might direct, this would appear to us to be a more brotherly way of proceeding were we in the Negro's condition. 3. Pure goodness tendeth to beget its own likeness, and where men are convinced that the conduct of those who have power over them is equitable, it naturally yields encouragement for them to provide against old age. The pure witness being reached, a care is thereby incited that they may not become a burden on the estates of those whom they have found to be honest men and true friends to them. But where men have labored without wages 9 years longer than is common with other men amongst whom they dwell, and then set free, and at going off are assured that those who so detain them are largely in their debt, but expect not to recover the debt except they become needy when unable to help themselves, such would naturally be induced to think this treatment unbrotherly, to think of the reasonableness of their wages being some time paid, to think that the estate in which they labored might reasonably assist them in old age, and thus be tempted to decline from a wise application to business. 4. If I see a man want relief, and know he hath money in my hands which must sometime be paid with reasonable use, either to him or to others by his direction, there appears in this case no temptation to withhold it at the time I saw that he wanted it. But if selfishness so far prevailed in me that I looked upon the money which I had in trust, with a desire to keep it from the true owner, as through the strength of desire, joined with expectation, at length so far considered it a part of my estate as to apply it in promoting myself or my family in the world, and therewith entered into expenses which a humble follower of Christ might have shunned. Hereby joining with one temptation, there's great danger in falling into more and of not attending to the wants of the man who had moneys in my hands, with that care and diligence, as I might have done, had the tempter found no entrance into my mind. 5. If we righteously account for the moneys which we have in security, with a reasonable use thereon, and frugally expend the whole in relieving the man who earned it, and more being wanted, the public refuseth to bear any part of that expense. If our estates have not been benefited aforetime by the labors of his fathers, nor ancestors, this appears to be a case wherein the righteous suffer for the testimony of a good conscience, and from which if faithfully attended to, they might in time, I trust, hope for relief. 6. The Negroes have been a suffering people, and we as a civil society are they by whom they have suffered. Now, where persons have been injured as to their outward substance and died without having recompense, their children appear to have a right to that which was equitably due to and detained from their fathers. My heart is affected with sorrow while I write on this subject, on account of the great injuries committed against these Gentiles, and against their children, who have been born in that captivity which is an unrighteous captivity. When the ancestors of these people were imported from Africa, some, I believe, bought them with intent to treat them kindly as slaves. They bought them as though those violent men had a right to sell them, but I believe without weightily considering the nature and tendency of such a bargain, and thus building on an unrighteous foundation, a veil was gradually drawn over a practice very grievous and afflicting to a great number of Gentiles. A care is now reviving in many places that this veil may be yet further removed, and that this disorder may be searched to the bottom. And my concern is that we may not only bear in mind that Negroes have been a suffering people under us as a civil society, but that we may in true humiliation feel for that pure influence which alone is able to guide us in the way where healing and restoration is expensed. Number 7. Having thus far spoken of the Negroes as equally entitled to the benefit of their labor with us, I feel it on my mind to mention that debt which is due to many Negroes of the present age. Where men within certain limits are so formed into a society as to become like a large body consisting of many members, here, whatever injuries are done to others not of this society by members of this society, if the society in whose power it is doth not use all reasonable endeavors to execute justice and judgment, nor publicly disown those unrighteous proceedings, the iniquities of individuals become chargeable on such civil society to which they remain united. And where persons have been injured as to their outward substance, and died without having recompense, so that their children are kept out of that which was equitably due to their parents, here such children appear to be justly entitled to receive recompense from that civil society under which their parents suffered. My heart is affected with sorrow while I write on this subject, on account of the great injuries committed against these Gentiles, against their children born in captivity. Had the active members in civil society, when those injustices were first attempted, united in a firm opposition to those violent proceedings, had others in a selfish spirit attempted the like afterward, and met with a firm opposition, and been made to do justice to the injured persons till the prospect of gain by such unrighteous proceedings appeared so doubtful that no further attempts had been made, how much better had it been for those American colonies and islands? Some, I believe, bought those poor sufferers with intent to treat them kindly as slaves. They bought them as though these violent men had a right to sell them, but I believe without entering deep enough into the consideration of these consequences of such proceedings. Others, I believe, bought them with the views of outward ease and profit, and thus those violent men found people of reputation who purchased their booty and built on that purchase as a foundation to exercise the authority of masters, and thus encouraged them in this horrible trade, till their proceedings were so far approved by the civil society as to consider those men as members without proceeding to punish them for their crimes. And hence a veil was in some measure drawn over a practice that most foreign to righteousness, and the face of things so disguised that under the most lamentable injustice but few appeared to be alarmed at it or zealously labored to have justice done to the sufferers and their posterity. These poor Africans were people of a strange language, and not easy to converse with, and their situation as slaves too generally destroyed that brotherly freedom which frequently subsists between us and inoffensive strangers. In this adverse condition, how reasonable is it to suppose that they would revolve in their distressed minds the iniquities committed against them and mourn without any to comfort them? Though through gradual proceedings in unrighteousness, dimness hath come over many minds, yet the nature of things are not altered. Long oppression hath not made oppression consistent with brotherly love, nor length of time through several ages made recompense to the posterity of those injured strangers. Many of them lived and died without having their suffering case heard, and determined according to equity, and under a degree of sorrow on account of the wantonness, the vanity, the superfluity too common amongst us as a civil society. Even while a heavy load of unrighteous proceedings lies upon us, do I now, under a feeling of universal love, and in a fervent concern for the real interest of my fellow members in society, as well as the interest of my fellow creatures in general, express these things. Suppose an inoffensive youth, 40 years ago, was violently taken from Guinea, sold here as a slave, labored hard till old age, and hath children who are now living. Though no sum may be properly mentioned as an equal reward for the total deprivation of liberty, yet if the suffering of this man be computed at no more than £50, I expect candid men will suppose it within bounds, and that his children have an equitable right to it. £50 at 3%, adding the interest to the principal once in 10 years, appears in 40 years to make upward of £140. Now in our minds are thoroughly divested of all prejudice in relation to the difference of color, and the love of Christ in which there is no partiality prevails upon us, I believe it will appear that a heavy account lies against us as a civil society for oppressions committed against people who did not injure us, and that if the particular case of many individuals were fairly stated, it would appear that there was considerable due to them. I conclude with the words of that righteous judge in Israel. Behold, here I am, witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose ass have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or of whose hand have I received any bribe to blind mine eyes therewith? And I will restore it to you. All right, so hopefully you can see a little bit of the distinction that I made here between the first part that I read and the second part of Woolman's work. Because this second part, I mean, he dealt with more systemic sorts of things, like a larger scale things. He dealt with, education, right, schooling. He dealt with Native Americans. He dealt with war. He dealt with enslavement, right? So, I mean, he's dealing with larger issues. And in the first, he's still bringing in individual action, of course, but he's kind of showing how individual action, a luxurious lifestyle, a focus on desires and those sorts of things, leads to these more systemic issues. So I don't need to belabor too much of this because, I mean, he speaks for himself. But, just to point out some of the big things, right? First, he talks about wars. That's the very first thing he talks about in chapter 10. And just discussing how exactly what James says, I brought up in the very beginning of the season, that, how does simplicity deal with nonviolence? Well, a number of ways, because when you get to this level of injustice that Woolman is talking about, there's a whole lot of violence going on to protect it and institute it. And that's exactly what James says. Where do wars come from? Right? Essentially, your desires. So Woolman is saying, when you've got all of these things that you want and all of these things that you accrue and therefore need to build fences around and need to protect, like that leads to violence, that leads to wars. You've got all of this booty that other people want to steal. And then you've got, all of this stuff that you are extremely defensive of and you don't trust people. And so you're more likely to do violence to people in protection of that. And we talked in the first season, talking about like victories without violence. We discussed a lot of times how one of the ways that violence was avoided was that, like if the Native Americans were attacking settlers and they found that they were dealing with Quakers and the Quakers didn't have any weapons, they'd be like, oh, you guys are good. Like, you're not here to harm us. And so they would, not all the time, of course, like innocent people, nonviolent people were killed all the time. But there were a lot of times that not having weapons and not having a whole bunch of stuff and not being greedy, not trying to take land, dealing peaceably with Native Americans. And it wasn't just with Native Americans. Victories without violence dealt with, a lot of other instances too. But when you don't live a luxurious lifestyle that others are trying to take, and when you're not living a luxurious lifestyle that makes other people wary of you, like, hey, wait a second, you've got so much. You're just going to try to take my stuff too, aren't you? And when you don't have weapons to try to defend that stuff, that can be one way to build trust with people. And partly why the Quakers had such good relations with the natives compared to everybody else. And Woolman gets into that just a little bit. He does deal with Native Americans, and he does bring up something. I think sometimes there can be kind of a pendulum swing because we're very critical of Europeans who came over and took land, and Woolman is too, right? He's saying, look, the natives, the people native to the United States, like they had a way of life that was handed down to them, and that's just fine. Like, we don't need to be critical of that. At the same time, like, there is some good thing about European mindset where we came from a place where we're more crowded, and so we want to get a good use out of the land. And so I think a lot of people are like, this was the natives' land, and they didn't have to give it to anybody. It was all their land. And you're like, well, why would a more sparsely populated people that have such a huge area of land, why would people, especially people on the left who tend to be more critical of property rights, sorts of, the existence of property rights. Like, why would you say that the natives owned all this land just because they were here first, right? So reasonably, Europeans seem to have a right to land as well, because they were coming over here. They were trying to provide for their families. And so if the natives here weren't using it all, then okay, yeah, Europeans had a right here as long as they weren't kicking other people off or doing harm to people. So there is a wise use of land that we could say the natives should have at least respected, even if we don't expect that they would have, pick that up. Maybe they would over time. Like they would have implemented some things that would have fit into their culture, and that would have been good. But whatever. Woolman says, though, he's like, okay, it's great to use land wisely, and that's something that we can do. Not saying that the natives were necessarily using it unwisely. They just didn't have to figure out how to condense things more until Europeans arrived. But like, think about all the land that we're trying to take. And if you look at the American Revolution, there's a lot going on there that isn't about freedom from taxes and stuff. I mean, taxes were a pittance. The U.S., the colonies didn't pay taxes. There was a salutary neglect under Great Britain for a while where the U.S. essentially paid no taxes. They were getting lots of benefits from Britain because Britain would send their army over here to defend, and we took more land, all kinds of things. So a lot of the American Revolution centered around, some of the big guys in there, like George Washington, second richest president in American history. He was a land speculator. Like, he wanted land. They were the colonists, the wealthy ones, were ticked that Great Britain was saying, hey, we're not going to encroach anymore to the west. Like, we're done. And they're like, well, but yeah, there's more land that we want to take. And so a lot of the American Revolution, or I don't know what percentage to assign, but certainly a portion of the American Revolution was land speculators wanting to grab more land. And Woolman here is not speaking directly to that, but he's like, guys, sure, getting use of land is good. It's great to do. But a lot of the stuff that you're wanting to do, you're not trying to provide for your families. You're not trying to simply subsist or simply exist. You are trying to grab luxuries. And you can see this because like a lot of what the colonists were doing was they were coming over here and planting money crops, right? They were planting tobacco. And you had colonies that came over here and they were literally starving to death and resorting to cannibalism because they were growing a bunch of tobacco and not learning how and figuring out how to garden so that they could survive, right? Stupidity, greed. There was lots of that kind of thing that was going on. And Woolman saying, yeah, we're saying that the natives are unwise because they have all this land that they spread across, but they're not like abusing that land like we are. Like we are taking this land and we're essentially digging up the soil and taking over land, not because we need to, but because we are just, we're greedy. And so Woolman is critiquing both there. And I think there's a tendency in our culture to just think that this was Native American land and that they should have had it all. And Europeans came and just took it. And yes, that's true. But it should be kind of a little bit more in the middle where, well, not more to the middle. It's definitely the natives were wronged horrendously. But there was a sense in which the Europeans had something to offer that the natives could have received had the Europeans enacted that appropriately, which some of them did. The Quakers and the natives, the Native Americans, they overall lived in really good harmony. And I think that's a great example of what the settling of the United States could have looked like. And that would have just made a huge difference, living in simplicity. So you should, that's probably one of my favorite sections in this book. I think it's worthwhile for you to take a look at that again. He talks about education. I think that's interesting. Probably my least interesting section here, but I did think it was interesting how he mentioned greed, and how school teachers got paid so little even then. And it reminded me of Dwight Eisenhower's speech about how, by investing in the army, we're essentially not building schools and stuff. And that's so true today. Like, we are valuing Wall Street, we're valuing the Pentagon. Like, those are by and large the two things and really those two go hand in hand, right? War and financiers. So here he's saying that, and he's saying you can tell when there's greed because low pay for teachers and large class sizes, more than teachers can have to adequately disciple their students. I was like, man, spot on, even in the 1700s. Then finally, enslavement. Now, I wasn't kind of sure. I don't know, like points 1 through 4 or 1 through 5. I was kind of like, wait a second. Did Woolman support slavery? Because he's talking about like keeping the enslaved like 9 years after they turn 20 or something. I'm like, what's going on? So I don't really know the context of that. Like there's probably something that was being talked about in Quaker circles at that time that he's trying to speak out about. But when you get to points 6 and 7, you can see that he is very clearly against enslavement. He thinks it's horrendous. He thinks it's unjust. It's interesting how he says, look, everybody knew it was wrong, but you try to say, well, I'm trying to do this good thing. I don't want somebody else to buy this enslaved person. I won't be violent. I'll purchase the enslaved, and then like I'll do this good thing, make this bad thing out of a good thing. And Woolman says, I'm sure some people were like that, and that a veil was pulled over their eyes. Like after you do that long enough, a veil gets pulled over your eyes, and then you're just blinded, because you take these small steps towards evil, towards more and more evil, and you kind of self-deceive. And so Woolman recognizes that that's a process that happened out of greed to use the enslaved, out of self-denial, out of trying to do good, paving the road to hell with those good intentions. So Woolman addresses a lot of that stuff. And he also addresses back pay for releasing enslaved, which the Quakers instituted. I don't know if Woolman was a part of that decision in the late 1700s, but certainly he had spoken enough about this that he probably influenced it a little bit. And he talks about essentially reparations. Like if the fathers are dead, you owe it to their kids, right? So he gets into all kinds of things, great things where he is trying to recognize justice. And he speaks, I think, some really great truths that we should reflect on. So I hope you enjoyed Woolman's work. He covered a lot of ground in a relatively short space. And he is a voice that we should hear out for sure.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.